He was thrown away like a mistake. Too weak, too fragile, left to die under the burning desert sun. But fate had other plans. An old soldier with nothing left to live for stumbled upon the helpless foal and made a choice that would change them both. What began as a fight for survival soon turned into a miracle that no one, least of all the man who had abandoned him, ever saw coming. The Texas sun was unforgiving that afternoon, its heat pressing down on the wide pastures like a heavy hand. Dust swirled around the weathered barns of Thompson Ranch, one of the largest horse-breeding farms in the county. Inside the dim stable, a tiny foal struggled to stand. Its spindly legs trembled beneath a fragile body, ribs visible through thin skin, and its breath came in shallow bursts. The foal's coat was a pale chestnut, barely shining, and a single white star marked its forehead like an afterthought of creation. Earl Thompson, the owner of the ranch, stood with his arms folded, a cigar clamped between his teeth. He was a man carved from hard years and harder ambition, his eyes cold and calculating as they swept over the newborn. Earl had built his reputation on breeding champions, massive stallions with glossy coats and records of victories at state fairs. This foal, born weak and premature, was a blemish on his carefully crafted empire. "Look at it," Earl muttered with disdain, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "Can't even hold itself up. What a waste." He spat the words onto the dirt floor, as if to rid himself of the disappointment. Jake Miller, the ranch hand barely in his 20s, stood beside him. Jake's calloused hands gripped the brim of his hat, his heart aching at the sight of the foal. He had spent his childhood around animals and had learned to love them in a way that Earl never understood. To Jake, this trembling little creature wasn't a failure. It was a life. "Mr. Thompson," Jake said softly. "Sometimes the weak ones just need a little more time." "We could give it a chance." Earl's eyes narrowed, sharp as barbed wire. "Time is money, boy. And I've wasted enough of both. That thing will never bring a dime. Best thing you can do is get rid of it before tomorrow's buyers show up. I won't have them seeing that mistake." The words hung heavy in the stable, each syllable slicing deeper into Jake's conscience. He looked back at the foal, who had finally managed to lift its head. Its dark eyes were wide, filled with a silent plea, as if it understood every cruel word spoken. Jake felt his chest tighten. "But sir, it's just a baby." Earl pulled the cigar from his lips, exhaling a cloud of smoke that curled like a curse in the air. "It's not a request, Jake. It's an order. Take it far from here. Leave it in the fields. Nature will do the rest." Earl turned on his heel and strode out, his boots striking the wooden floor with finality. The sound echoed until only silence and the shallow breaths of the foal remained. Jake lingered, torn between obedience and compassion. He crouched down, his shadow falling over the tiny body. The foal nickered weakly, the sound barely more than a whisper. Jake reached out, brushing his rough hand against its soft muzzle. "You don't deserve this," he whispered, his throat tightening. "But I don't have a choice." As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson, Jake led the foal out of the stable with a makeshift rope around its fragile neck. Each step seemed to cost the little creature everything, its hooves dragging in the dirt. Jake's heart broke with every stumble, but Earl's command rang in his ears louder than his own conscience. They walked past the endless pastures of healthy, strong horses, creatures that Earl prized, their muscles rippling, their heads held high. The foal turned its head toward them, as if sensing it would never belong among them. Jake swallowed hard, forcing his eyes forward. By the time they reached the far edge of the ranch, the land had changed. The lush fields gave way to scrub and dust, to the dry breath of the desert. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries haunting the twilight. Jake's steps faltered. He loosened the rope, his chest heavy with shame. "This is as far as I can take you," he murmured, his voice cracking. He bent low, pressing his forehead to the foal's. "I'm sorry." The foal's eyes, wide and innocent, searched his face as though asking why. Jake's stomach twisted. He straightened, pulling the rope free, and clapped his hands sharply. "Go on!" he shouted, trying to force the creature to move. But the foal stayed, trembling, its legs shaking. Desperation clawed at Jake. He picked up a small stone and tossed it near the foal's hooves, not to hurt, but to scare. The foal flinched, ears flattening, and staggered a few steps away before stopping again. Jake's breath caught. He picked up another rock, this one heavier, and hurled it farther. "Go!" he cried, his voice breaking. At last, the foal turned, stumbling toward the horizon, its silhouette shrinking against the dying light. Jake stood rooted, watching until the fragile figure disappeared into the folds of dusk. His eyes burned, and he swiped a hand across his face, ashamed of the tears. When he finally turned back toward the ranch, the sky was swallowed by night. Behind him, the little foal was alone in the vast desert, its faint cries lost to the wind. The night wrapped itself around Jake as he walked back to the ranch, his boots crunching against the dry earth. But behind him, in the vast emptiness of the desert's edge, the little foal had been left to face the world alone. The sky stretched wide, littered with stars that shimmered faintly over the barren landscape. Coyotes called in the distance, their cries carried on the wind, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked beyond human reach. The foal staggered, its fragile legs trembling with every step, each movement more a struggle for survival than progress. The land was merciless. Sagebrush scraped against the foal's thin legs as it wandered, searching for something, anything, to ease its thirst. Its small, chestnut body seemed too delicate for the rugged land, ribs showing sharply against its skin. Every so often, it would pause, head hanging low, breath shallow. The single white star on its forehead glowed faintly under the moonlight, as if the night itself refused to let it disappear completely. By dawn, the heat returned with a vengeance. The desert floor shimmered, the air itself quivering in waves of heat. The foal's tongue swelled in its mouth, lips cracked, but no water could be found. It pressed its muzzle against the ground, hoping for moisture, but tasted only dust. Its soft cries echoed faintly, weak sounds swallowed by the vastness. Birds circled high above, patient and merciless observers. Hours dragged into a blur. The foal stumbled against a rock, collapsing in the thin shadow it offered. It lay there, sides heaving, too weak to rise again. The sun burned overhead, relentless, time lost meaning. Only thirst and exhaustion remained. Every sound of the wind seemed like a whisper, urging it to surrender. Yet, beneath the frailty, there was a stubborn spark, the same spark that had helped it survive its first fragile hours. Back at Thompson Ranch, Jake worked in silence, avoiding Earl's sharp eyes. The buyers had come and gone, admiring the strong colts Earl paraded with pride. But Jake's mind drifted again and again to the fragile creature he had left behind. At night, when the barn was quiet and the other horses settled into their stalls, Jake would sit alone on a bale of hay, remembering the foal's dark eyes. They haunted him, wide with confusion and trust, even as he drove it away. Shame weighed heavier with each passing hour, but miles away, the foal remained lost in its own battle. The second night fell, cooler now, but with it came new threats. Shadows moved across the land, coyotes drawn by the scent of weakness. The foal's ears twitched, its body shivering though the air was still. One of the coyotes crept closer, eyes glinting in the moonlight. The foal tried to push itself up, legs quaking beneath it, but collapsed again with a low cry. The predator lingered, pacing, testing. Then, with a sudden shift in the wind, it hesitated and slunk away, as if some unseen hand had granted the foal a reprieve. The third day dawned, merciless and dry. The foal moved slower now, each step uncertain. It found brief shelter under a twisted mesquite tree, its shadow meager but enough to shield it from the full force of the sun. There it lay still, breaths shallow, eyes half closed. For a moment, it seemed as though the desert had claimed it, another forgotten life lost to indifference. And yet, the white star on its forehead caught the first sliver of moonlight as dusk approached, shining faintly in the dimming sky. It was the smallest sign of resilience, a quiet refusal to disappear. The foal remained, clinging to life as though waiting for something, or someone who might still care. The night stretched on, still and silent, the desert vast and merciless. But fate had already begun to stir, guiding the steps of a man who carried his own scars, a man whose path would soon cross with the abandoned creatures. The foal, barely breathing, had no way of knowing that the road ahead would not only test its strength, but also awaken a miracle neither man nor beast could have foreseen. Henry Walker rose with the dawn, as he always did. His small farmhouse sat on the edge of New Mexico's dry plains, a place where silence stretched farther than the horizon. The years had carved deep lines into his weathered face, and his body carried the stiffness of old wounds, souvenirs from a war long past. His days were simple now, tending a modest garden, feeding his mule, patching fences that always seemed to give way to the relentless wind. Yet beneath the routine lay an emptiness that no chore could fill. He had once had a family, a wife who loved his stubborn nature, and a son who had inherited her gentle smile. Both gone now, one to illness, one to the battlefield. Henry lived on, a survivor in a world that had taken too much from him. That morning, the air was heavy with dust, the sky cloudless and wide. Henry loaded a sack of grain onto his mule and started toward the small town a few miles away. He traveled slowly, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his joints aching from the miles he'd walked in his life. He had learned to endure pain quietly. It was as much a companion to him as the loneliness. On his way back, as the sun climbed higher, Henry spotted something unusual along the stretch of desert road. At first, it seemed like just another lifeless shape lying beneath a scraggly mesquite tree, the kind of sight common in lands where water was scarce and the strong outlasted the weak. He might have passed it by, just another casualty of the desert's cruelty. But something tugged at him, a faint movement, a flicker of life. Henry pulled the mule to a stop, squinting against the harsh light. He stepped down with effort, boots sinking into the hot dust. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a small chestnut foal, its body gaunt and trembling, its breath uneven and shallow. The animal's head lay against the ground, but its eyes fluttered open at his shadow, revealing dark orbs clouded with exhaustion, but not yet extinguished. "Lord Almighty," Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "Who would leave a creature like this out here?" He knelt with difficulty, his knees protesting. His calloused hand reached out to the foal's neck, feeling the faint, uneven pulse beneath its fragile skin. The animal quivered weakly, as though the touch itself was both comfort and burden. Henry's throat tightened. He had seen many forms of abandonment in his life, soldiers left behind, families broken apart, but the sight of this helpless creature struck a chord too deep to ignore. The foal made a sound, not quite a cry, more like a sigh slipping through cracked lips. Its forehead bore a small, white marking, a star-shaped patch that glowed faintly in the fading light of day. Henry stared at it, transfixed. "A little star," he murmured. "Or maybe just plain luck." He hesitated, then gave the foal a name aloud. "Lucky. That's what I'll call you." For a moment, Henry sat still, his heart wrestling with reason. He had little enough for himself, just a patch of land, a mule, and the bare necessities that kept him alive. Taking on a weak, half-dead foal made no sense. It would be work, sacrifice, and perhaps heartbreak when the animal failed to survive. But as he looked into its eyes, something stirred inside him, something he thought had died with his family. The need to protect, to care, to not let another soul slip away unloved. Henry sighed deeply, then reached for the canteen at his belt. He tipped a few drops of water onto his fingers and pressed them against the foal's parched lips. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a faint reflex, the animal's tongue flicked, and it swallowed. Henry smiled through the sting in his eyes. "That's it, little one. Don't give up on me yet." He looked back at his mule, who shifted impatiently under the weight of the grain sack. "You won't like this, old girl," Henry muttered, "but we've got a new passenger." With slow, deliberate movements, Henry gathered the frail foal in his arms. The weight was barely more than that of a large dog, but his old bones screamed in protest. Still, he lifted, grunting with the effort, until he had settled the trembling body across the mule's back. The mule brayed in irritation, but did not resist. "Come on then," Henry said, steadying the foal with one hand while leading the mule with the other. "Let's see if we can give you another chance." The journey home was long and slow. The foal swayed weakly on the mule's back, its head lolling, eyes closing as though sleep were all that remained. Henry spoke softly to it the entire way, words tumbling out that he hadn't spoken in years. He told the foal about his small farm, about the apple tree that stubbornly bore fruit even in the harsh soil, about the stream that had dried up long ago. He confessed how the silence of his house pressed down on him at night, how sometimes he wished he'd been taken instead of his son. As he walked, Henry realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't talking to himself. When they finally reached his farm, dusk had settled across the land. The house stood small and weather-beaten, the barn leaning slightly, as though it, too, had grown tired. Henry led the mule into the barn, lowering the foal gently onto a bed of straw. The creature barely, stirred, but its chest still rose and fell. That was enough. Henry brought a bucket of water from the well, dipping a rag into it and wiping the dust from the foal's coat. He mixed a little ground grain with milk and coaxed a few drops between its lips. The foal swallowed weakly, and Henry's heart lifted. "You're safe now, Lucky," he said softly, stroking the small white star on its forehead. "We've both been left behind, but maybe together. Maybe we can make something out of what's left." Outside, the wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying with it the faint scent of rain that never seemed to come. Inside the barn, two souls, one old and scarred, the other young and fragile, shared a fragile bond that neither had expected. For Henry, it was not just the rescue of a foal. It was the first step toward saving himself. The night was long and restless inside Henry's barn. The air was cool compared to the desert's unforgiving heat, but it carried the smell of dust and hay. Henry sat on a wooden stool beside the foal, his hands never far from the bucket of water and the rag he used to moisten its lips. The animal lay curled in the straw, body frail and still, each breath shallow, as though it might be the last. Henry's eyes, heavy from exhaustion, refused to close. He had promised himself he would not let this small creature slip away without a fight. Every so often, Lucky stirred, his ears twitching faintly at the creak of wood or the low bray of Henry's mule in the next stall. Henry leaned forward each time, whispering encouragement. "Stay with me, little one. You've come too far to give up now." The words were tender, almost desperate, as though Henry were speaking not just to the foal, but to the ghosts of his own past. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the gaps in the barn wall, falling across Lucky's face. Henry had just dozed off in the chair when he heard a faint sound. A soft, uncertain whinny. His eyes flew open. Lucky's head had lifted slightly from the straw, eyes half-lidded but alive. Henry's heart leapt. He scrambled to dip his fingers in the pail of milk mixed with crushed grain, holding them carefully to the foal's lips. This time, Lucky licked weakly at the offering. It was barely more than a gesture, but it was enough to draw tears to Henry's tired eyes. "That's it, Lucky," Henry whispered, his voice trembling. "That's the spirit." The day stretched into slow hours of care. Henry cleaned the foal's coat again and again, wiping away dirt and dried sweat until the chestnut color shone faintly beneath the grime. He shifted the straw to make a softer bed, carried extra buckets of water from the well, and mixed more feed than he could spare from his own supplies. The effort left his back aching and his arms heavy. But every time Lucky swallowed, every time the foal's eyelids fluttered open, Henry felt a surge of strength he hadn't known he still possessed. By the second evening, Lucky attempted something more. He pushed his front legs against the straw, wobbling, his body trembling under the effort. He collapsed almost instantly, but Henry was there, steadying him. "Don't rush it," Henry said gently, running a hand over the foal's star-marked forehead. "We'll take it one step at a time." That night, as he lit the lantern and settled again to keep watch, Henry realized how profoundly the barn had changed. Where once it had been silent and empty, filled only with the slow rhythms of his mule and the rustle of hay, now there was a heartbeat of hope. The foal's fragile struggle had awakened something in him, a need to nurture, to fight for more than his own survival. On the third morning, Henry woke to a sound he hadn't expected. the faint shuffle of hooves on straw. Lucky was standing, unsteady and swaying, but upright. His legs quaked under his weight, yet his head lifted proudly, ears flicking at the morning sounds. Henry froze, afraid that moving would break the spell. Then, slowly, his lips curved into a smile. He rose and placed a hand on Lucky's neck, feeling the trembling muscles. "You're full of miracles, aren't you?" Henry said softly. His chest ached with something he hadn't felt in years. Pure joy. Throughout the day, Henry helped the foal take a few tentative steps inside the barn. Each time Lucky faltered, Henry steadied him, speaking words of encouragement. He found himself talking constantly, filling the silence with stories of his past, memories of his son, confessions he had never shared with another living soul. Lucky listened with those wide, dark eyes, blinking slowly, as though absorbing every word. That evening, Mary Collins appeared at the barn door. She was carrying a basket of bread, her face stern but curious. "Henry Walker," she called, her voice sharp as ever. "I hear you've gone and taken in some half-dead animal." Henry straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "You heard right," he said, stepping aside so she could see. Mary peered into the stall and blinked. Lucky was resting again, but his chest rose steadily, his coat cleaner now, the white star on his forehead catching the lantern's glow. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. For a moment, the usual hardness in her eyes softened. "Looks like you've got yourself a fighter." Henry nodded, his throat thick with unspoken pride. "We both do," he replied. Mary shook her head, muttering something about Henry being stubborn, but she left the bread behind as she walked away. Henry watched her go, then turned back to Lucky with a quiet smile. As night fell once more, Henry settled into his chair, the foal breathing steadily beside him. The barn was filled with a peace he hadn't known in decades. For the first time since he had buried his son, Henry felt that maybe life still had something worth holding on to. The small miracle lying in the straw was proof enough. The morning sun poured across the dry fields, gilding the edges of Henry's worn fence line. The barn doors creaked open, and Henry stepped out with a bucket of water balanced in his hands. His back ached from nights spent half sleeping in a chair, but the sound of faint hooves shifting in the straw behind him was worth every pain. Lucky was alive, and for Henry, that was enough to keep going. Word had begun to spread through the small town a few miles away. Henry Walker, the old war veteran who lived like a hermit, had taken in a dying foal. Curiosity traveled fast in places where not much else did. And with curiosity came judgment. Mary Collins arrived again that day, her steps brisk and her mouth tight with disapproval. She stood in the doorway of the barn, her hands on her hips, staring at Lucky, who had just managed to push himself upright for a few shaky seconds before collapsing into the straw again. "Henry Walker," she said flatly, "you're out of your mind. That thing should have been left where you found it. You can't save every broken thing the world tosses your way." Henry didn't look up. He was kneeling by the foal, stroking the soft patch of white on its forehead. "I'm not trying to save every broken thing," he replied calmly. "Just this one." Mary sighed, the sound sharp with impatience. "You can barely afford to keep yourself fed, let alone nurse some half-dead colt." "What happens when it dies, Henry? You'll be left with nothing but more heartache." Henry stood slowly, his joints stiff, his gaze steady. "If it dies, at least it won't have died alone. That's more than most souls get in this world." The words silenced her for a moment. Mary crossed her arms, glancing at Lucky, who blinked up at her with dark, liquid eyes. Something flickered across her expression, an unwilling softness, but she quickly turned it back into a scowl. "You're wasting your strength," she muttered. But when she left, Henry noticed she'd left a small sack of oats leaning against the barn wall. The days passed in a rhythm of exhaustion and fragile progress. Lucky ate a little more each morning, his legs finding strength enough to stand for longer stretches. At times, Henry would coax him into taking a few wobbly steps across the barn floor, his hand steady at the colt's side. Mary, despite her constant protests, came by more often. Each time she brought something new, a jar of salve, a bundle of carrots, even an old blanket. She always delivered them with a grumble. "Don't get the wrong idea. Just figured you might need it," she'd say. But Henry saw through the facade. Her eyes betrayed her heart. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Henry and Mary stood side by side watching Lucky attempt a small circle around the barn. His legs trembled, but he pressed on, guided by Henry's soft encouragement. At one point he stumbled hard, almost falling, but caught himself and pushed forward. Mary exhaled slowly, her arms still folded. "That's one stubborn little horse." Henry smiled faintly. "Stubbornness runs in good company." Mary shot him a look, but said nothing more. As the weeks edged forward, Lucky's chestnut coat began to gleam faintly under Henry's constant care. The hollow look in his eyes faded, replaced by a quiet resilience. Henry talked to him endlessly, about the days when he had marched across foreign soil, about the nights he'd spent awake, listening to the silence of his empty house. Lucky listened in stillness, ears flicking as though he understood. But not everyone in town looked kindly on Henry's devotion. At the general store, whispers followed him. "Fool's wasting his last years on a horse that should have been put down," one man muttered. Another chuckled. "Guess war broke his head. Now he's playing nursemaid to a lost cause." Henry heard them all, but he didn't respond. He returned to his mule, loaded with supplies he could barely afford, and walked back toward the small miracle waiting in his barn. Their judgment meant nothing compared to the sound of hooves shifting, the soft nicker that greeted him when he pushed open the barn door. Mary was there that evening, waiting with her arms crossed. "You heard what they're saying," she said without preamble. "I heard," Henry replied simply, kneeling to refill Lucky's bucket. "They think you've gone mad." Henry chuckled softly, though his eyes stayed fixed on the foal. "Let them. Maybe I have. But if madness means not turning my back on him, I'll live with it." Mary shook her head, but this time there was no scorn in her voice. "You're going to break your back for this animal, Henry. And yet, I can't say I want you to stop." The barn grew quiet, the only sound the soft breathing of the colt. Henry glanced at her, surprised by the admission. She met his gaze briefly, then turned away, cheeks flushed in the dim light. Lucky lay his head back down, his body still frail, but his spirit undeniable. Henry reached out, running a hand along his mane. "We'll prove them wrong, won't we, Lucky?" he whispered. Mary didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. She stood there, lingering, as if she too wanted to believe in something beyond doubt. The desert heat clung stubbornly to the air, even as summer began to wane. Henry's farm sat beneath the wide New Mexico sky, a place where the horizon seemed endless, and the silence was broken only by the sigh of the wind. For weeks now, the barn had become the heart of Henry's life, pulsing with the fragile rhythm of a chestnut foal learning to live again. Each morning, Henry rose before the sun, his bones stiff, but his spirit unwilling to slow. He mixed what little he had into a mash of oats and milk, coaxing Lucky to eat. At first, the foal could only manage a mouthful or two before exhaustion claimed him, but slowly, stubbornly, his appetite grew. By the second week, he lifted his head eagerly when Henry entered with the bucket. By the third, he nickered softly at the sound of Henry's boots approaching the stall. Lucky's body remained thin, his ribs still visible, but the dullness had begun to fade from his eyes. They followed Henry with sharpness now, curious, alive. His legs, once trembling beneath him, carried him a few steps farther each day. Henry kept a steady hand at his side, ready to catch him if he faltered. "One more step, Lucky," he'd say, voice rough but warm. "Just one more." At night, the barn echoed with their quiet companionship. Henry often sat in his chair, lantern light flickering across the foal's small body. He would speak into the stillness. Memories of his son. Confessions he'd never shared with another soul. "I see him in you sometimes," Henry admitted once, his voice breaking. "That same fire, even when you're about to fall." Lucky turned his head then, pressing his muzzle weakly into Henry's arm. It wasn't understanding, not in words, but it was something deeper. Mary visited often, though she pretended each time that it was out of practical concern. She'd bring jars of herbal salves, or sacks of grain she insisted were extra. Her sharp words hadn't softened, but her actions betrayed her heart. Once, when Lucky managed to stand for nearly half an hour, Mary was there. She crossed her arms tightly, muttering, "Still looks too frail?" Yet Henry caught the shine of tears in her eyes before she turned away. There were setbacks, too. Some nights Lucky shivered with fever, sweat dampening his coat despite the dry air. Henry stayed by his side, wiping his body with a damp cloth, whispering encouragement through clenched teeth. "Stay with me, boy. Don't you quit now." He fought the fear that each labored breath might be the last, but each morning brought renewal. Lucky would open his eyes, weary but alive, and Henry would let out a sigh that was half relief, half prayer. The town's gossip hadn't faded. At the feed store, Henry overheard men shaking their heads. "He's wasting his time," one said. "That colt's nothing but a burden." But Henry no longer carried their judgment with him. He returned home each evening to the barn, where Lucky's slow progress was proof enough that hope was not wasted. One particularly hot afternoon, Henry opened the barn doors wide to let in a breeze. Lucky stepped cautiously onto the packed earth outside, blinking against the bright sun. His legs wobbled at first, but then he took a few tentative strides into the open air. Henry walked beside him, his heart swelling at the sight. "That's it," he said softly. "Feel the sun, feel the ground. This is your world now." The foal stopped, lifting his head toward the horizon as if testing the wide, empty expanse. For a moment, Henry saw more than survival in his stance. He saw the shadow of the horse. Lucky might become strong, fast, unbroken by the cruelty of his beginnings. That night, Henry lay in bed for the first time in weeks instead of the barn. He could still hear the faint shuffle of hooves, the soft sound of breathing drifting through the open window. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest that was more than pain. It was hope. But hope was fragile, and Henry knew it. The desert was unforgiving, and life had taught him that nothing was guaranteed. Still, as he drifted into sleep, he held on to the image of Lucky lifting his head to the horizon, as though daring the world to try and break him again. In those days of survival, both man and foal learned something vital. Broken does not mean finished. Autumn swept over the desert with a gentler hand than summer, but the land still wore its scars. Dust coated the fence rails and clung to Henry's boots as he trudged toward the barn at first light. Inside, Lucky was already awake, ears flicking, his head lifting with alertness that had once seemed impossible. The foal had grown taller in the weeks since Henry first carried him home. His legs, though still thin, no longer buckled beneath him with every attempt to stand. He could walk now, stumbling, awkward, but walking. Henry leaned against the stall door, his chest swelling with quiet pride. "Look at you," he said softly, voice raspy with sleep. "Stronger every day." He opened the gate and guided Lucky outside. The colt hesitated for a moment at the threshold of the barn, nostrils flaring at the crisp morning air, then stepped forward. His hooves met the packed earth with new confidence. The sun rose behind him, catching the white star on his forehead and making it gleam. Henry led him toward the pasture, letting him explore. Lucky lowered his head, sniffing at tufts of brittle grass, then lifted it sharply when a bird burst from a nearby bush. His legs tensed, muscles unsteady but eager. For the first time, Henry saw a spark of energy in him that was more than survival. It was the beginnings of spirit. Mary arrived just as Lucky took his first tentative trot across the yard. She stopped at the fence, basket of vegetables in her arms, her eyes widening. "Well, I'll be," she muttered. The colt stumbled once, nearly falling, but caught himself and pressed on, circling back toward Henry with an awkward but determined gait. Henry grinned, unable to hide the joy spilling from him. "Told you he's tougher than he looks." Mary rolled her eyes, but the smile tugging at the corners of her mouth betrayed her. "Still scrawny," she said, setting the basket down. "But I'll admit, he's got more fight in him than I gave him credit for." Henry chuckled, patting Lucky's neck as the colt pressed close to him. "Fight's what keeps us alive out here." That evening, Henry tried something new. He tied a loose rope around Lucky's chest, gently guiding him around the yard in slow circles, and first the colt resisted, pulling back, ears twitching nervously. But Henry's steady hand and calm voice eased him forward. Each step built on the last until Lucky was following him with surprising obedience. "You see," Henry said, stroking his mane, "you're learning, just like any soldier." The comparison stirred old memories, marches across fields of dust, young men stumbling under the weight of packs, Henry's own voice urging them on. He swallowed hard, pushing the ghosts away. This training was different. This wasn't about war or survival against enemies. It was about giving Lucky the tools to stand tall in a world that had tried to discard him. Over the next weeks, Lucky's strength grew rapidly. He ventured farther into the pasture, sometimes breaking into short bursts of clumsy speed. The sight made Henry's heart pound. He kept a close watch, ready to intervene, but each time Lucky recovered on his own, determination blazing in his eyes. One late afternoon, a dust storm swept suddenly across the plains. The sky darkened, the wind howled, rattling the barn doors. Henry rushed outside, calling for Lucky, who had been grazing near the fence. The colt bolted in panic, his small body cutting across the swirling dust. For a moment, Henry feared the storm would overwhelm him. But then, through the haze, he saw Lucky running, not stumbling, not faltering, but running with a desperate, wild grace. By the time Henry reached him, panting and half-blinded by grit, Lucky was standing firm at the fence line, chest heaving but unbroken. Henry laid a hand on his neck, relief flooding him. "You've got fire in you, boy," he whispered. "More than I ever dreamed." When the storm passed, the yard lay cloaked in silence, dust settling like a veil. Henry led Lucky back into the barn, brushing the grit from his coat. The colt leaned into the touch, calm now, as though the storm had awoken something deep within him. That night, as lantern light flickered across the barn walls, Henry sat watching Lucky doze in the straw. The foal was no longer just a fragile survivor clinging to life. He was rising, piece by piece, from the dust of his past. And Henry, for the first time in years, felt as though he was rising too. The first frost of the season touched the grass one morning, silvering the edges of the pasture. Henry pulled his jacket tighter against the chill, his breath clouding in the crisp air. Lucky stood at the fence, head lifted, his chestnut coat beginning to shine with health. He was still lean, his legs too long for his growing body, but there was power in his stance now. Henry opened the gate, and the colt stepped into the open field, ears twitching, nostrils flaring at the scent of the cold wind. For weeks, Henry had guided Lucky through careful steps, slow circles, and short trots. But on that morning, something shifted. A sudden gust swept across the plains, carrying with it the smell of rain and distant mountains. Lucky froze, his muscles tense. Then, as if answering some hidden call, he bolted forward. Henry shouted, startled, but then stood still, watching. The colt raced across the pasture, clumsy no longer. His hooves struck the ground in rhythm, his mane whipped back, his body stretched as though he were flying. For the first time, Lucky wasn't simply surviving or learning. He was running for the sheer joy of it. The sight brought Henry to his knees in the cold grass. He had seen horses run before, strong stallions bred for speed and power, but this was different. Lucky wasn't polished, wasn't trained like the champions he had once watched at county fairs, but he carried something else. Wildness. Freedom, the raw spirit of survival turned into strength. Henry's throat tightened, and tears blurred his vision. "Run, Lucky," he whispered. "Show the world what you've got." Lucky circled back, slowing near the fence, chest heaving, eyes alight. He nickered at Henry, who laughed through his tears. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Henry said, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Well, you're not wrong." That evening, Mary stopped by with a loaf of cornbread wrapped in a towel. Henry waved her toward the pasture. "You should have seen him today," he said, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Ran like the wind itself." Mary leaned against the fence, watching Lucky graze. She raised an eyebrow. "Still looks skinny to me." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "You'll see. He's different." Mary studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You're different too, Henry." "Haven't seen you smile like that in years." Her words lingered with him long after she left. He sat on the porch that night, staring at the stars, remembering how long it had been since hope had lit his heart. Lucky wasn't just a horse to him now. He was a reminder that even after ruin, something new could rise. In the weeks that followed, Henry began letting Lucky run farther, opening the gates to the outer fields. Each time, the colt exploded into motion. Faster, smoother, more sure of himself. Henry marked the time with an old pocket watch, his heart swelling as the numbers improved. He knew nothing of official training, but his instincts told him the truth. Lucky was fast. One afternoon, a pickup truck slowed on the dirt road bordering Henry's land. A man leaned out the window, squinting at the sight of the colt sprinting across the field. "That your horse?" he called. Henry shaded his eyes. "That's him." The man whistled low. "Runs like he's got fire in him." Henry just smiled, pride swelling in his chest. That night, as Lucky rested in the barn, Henry lingered by the stall, stroking his mane. "You've come a long way, boy," he murmured. "From the edge of death to this. Whatever the future holds, we'll face it together." The wind rattled the barn roof, carrying with it the scent of opens, plains, and distant storms. Lucky lifted his head, ears pricked, as if he too was listening to something beyond the walls. Henry felt it then, deep in his bones. This was only the beginning. The town of Albuquerque came alive each summer with the county fair, a tradition that drew ranchers, families, and curious travelers from miles around. Bright banners fluttered above the dusty main street, the smell of fried food and hay mingling with the sound of fiddles and laughter. For Henry, the fair had always been something he watched from the edges, a reminder of the community he had withdrawn from long ago. But this year was different. This year, he had Lucky. Mary had been the first to suggest it. She stood in Henry's kitchen, arms crossed, her sharp eyes fixed on him as he tried to brush off the idea. "You've spent months nursing that horse back from death," she said. "People ought to see what you've done." "And maybe Lucky deserves to be seen." Henry shook his head. "He's not ready for crowds. He's barely ready for a pasture." But Mary didn't back down. "Sometimes it's not about being ready. Sometimes it's about proving you belong." The words lingered in Henry's mind. He thought of the whispers in town, the way people still looked at him with pity or doubt. Maybe it was time to show them that the colt they'd all dismissed as hopeless was something more. And maybe, deep down, Henry needed to prove it to himself too. On the morning of the fair, Henry loaded Lucky into a borrowed trailer, his hands shaking with nerves. The colt shifted restlessly, ears flicking at the strange confinement, but Henry kept a hand on his neck, murmuring calm words. "Easy, boy. We'll get through this." When they arrived, the fairgrounds buzzed with energy. Children ran between booths, cotton candy in their hands, while ranchers paraded their finest livestock for ribbons and trophies. The horse arena was crowded, filled with sleek, polished animals gleaming under the sun. Compared to them, Lucky looked out of place. Still lean, his coat healthy but unremarkable beside the glossy sheen of the others. As Henry led him toward the entry gate, he heard the laughter. "That's Walker's colt? Looks like he's half-starved." Another voice chimed in. "Old man's lost his mind. That horse won't last a mile." Henry's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He felt Lucky tense beside him, the colt's ears swiveling nervously at the noise and chaos. Henry stopped, crouched slightly, and placed a hand on the star-shaped marking on Lucky's forehead. "Ignore them, Lucky. You've already beaten worse odds." The first event was a simple timed run around the small track, meant to test agility more than speed. Lucky pawed at the ground, uncertain, as the announcer called their names. Henry had no riding tack fancy enough for show, just a plain bridle and a lead rope. But when the gate opened, Lucky surged forward. The crowd fell quiet. The colt's strides were awkward at first, his long legs fumbling on the packed dirt. A few people chuckled. But then something shifted. Lucky found his rhythm. His body stretched, his strides lengthened, and suddenly he was moving with fluid grace. Dust kicked up behind him as he rounded the final turn, Henry's heart hammering with every beat of hooves. By the time Lucky crossed the line, the laughter had stopped. The clock showed a time that wasn't the fastest of the day, but it was faster than anyone had expected from the colt they had mocked. A murmur ran through the crowd. Henry rubbed Lucky's neck, pride swelling in his chest. "You did it, boy." "You showed them?" "Throughout the day," Lucky continued to surprise. In small exhibitions, obstacle runs, short sprints, he showed not only speed but an uncanny determination, refusing to quit even when he stumbled. By the afternoon, whispers had shifted. "That's the colt walker found in the desert? Looks like he's got real fire." Mary stood at the edge of the arena, arms crossed, but smiling openly now. When Henry walked past with Lucky, she said quietly, "Told you. He belongs here." But not everyone was impressed. Earl Thompson had arrived at the fair with his own horses, sleek thoroughbreds that drew admiration wherever they went. He spotted Lucky from across the arena, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face, then recognition. He leaned toward another rancher, muttering, "That colt, I've seen him before." Henry caught the look, but ignored it, leading Lucky back toward the trailer as the sun dipped low. He had come to prove something, and he had. Yet in the back of his mind, he felt a shadow stirring, a sense that this was only the beginning of a larger fight. That night, as the fair wound down and the lights dimmed, Henry stood by Lucky's stall, stroking his mane. "You did good, boy," he said softly. "Better than I ever dreamed." Lucky pressed his muzzle into Henry's chest, eyes soft, as though he knew. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, carrying with it both promise and warning. The fair had ended, but the whispers lingered long after Henry and Lucky returned to their quiet farm. In town, people still spoke of the chestnut colt who had surprised everyone, the half-starved foal that ran with unexpected fire. For Henry, the pride of that day carried him through his chores, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his mouth whenever Lucky trotted confidently at his side. But shadows were stirring, and one of them belonged to Earl Thompson. Earl could not forget the sight of that white star on Lucky's forehead. It was too familiar. Years of breeding had taught him to recognize the smallest traits in his horses, and this colt bore the mark of one of his own mares, a valuable bloodline he had thought lost. He had dismissed the foal once, cast it aside as weak and worthless. But seeing it alive, stronger than ever, gnawed at him. It wasn't pride that burned in Earl's chest. It was greed, and the fear that someone else had turned his mistake into a treasure. Jake Miller, the ranch hand who had carried out Earl's order to abandon the foal months earlier, had also been at the fair. He had stood in the crowd, his stomach twisting as he recognized the colt he had left in the desert. He didn't cheer with the others when Lucky ran. Instead, guilt welled inside him, heavier than it had ever been. That night, he sat alone in his bunkhouse, replaying the foal's eyes in his memory, the same eyes that had haunted him ever since. At Henry's farm, life settled into a new rhythm. Lucky's training continued, the colt stronger each day, his stride smoother, his speed undeniable. Henry timed him with his pocket watch on a stretch of field he had marked with stones. Each run was faster, each pause filled with the sound of Henry's ragged laughter, disbelief mixing with pride. Mary often watched from the fence. Her skepticism melted into quiet admiration. She teased Henry less now, though she still shook her head. "You're making that horse into something dangerous," she warned one evening. "People will notice." Henry shrugged. "Let them. I don't hide what I'm proud of." But one afternoon, as Lucky sprinted across the field, Henry caught sight of a truck parked on the road. The window rolled down, and Earl Thompson's face stared back, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met for a long, heavy moment. Then Earl drove away without a word. Henry stood frozen, unease prickling through him. He hadn't seen Earl in years, and he knew the man's reputation well. What he wanted, he claimed, no matter the cost. That night, as he rubbed Lucky's coat, he whispered, "You're mine, boy. No one's taking you away." Meanwhile, Jake made his way into town, restless with guilt. He drank in silence at the saloon, avoiding conversation, until finally the words burst from him. "I left that colt to die," he muttered to no one in particular. A few heads turned, but most ignored him. He buried his face in his hands. He wanted to find Henry, to confess, to make it right. But fear of Earl's wrath kept him tethered. Back on the ranch, Earl spoke to his foreman with venom. "That old fool Walker has my horse. I want him back. That bloodline is mine, and I'll prove it." He lit a cigar, the flame flaring in the darkness. He thinks he saved some stray. But the law will say otherwise. The tension grew like a storm cloud. Henry could feel it in the quiet moments, the way Lucky pricked his ears toward the road, as though sensing eyes watching from afar. Mary noticed it too. "You've stirred something, Henry," she said softly one night. "And I don't think Earl Thompson's the kind of man to let it go." Henry looked at Lucky, the colt, who had risen from death to run like the wind, and set his jaw. "Let him try," he said. "We'll face whatever comes." The ghost of the past had returned, and it was hungry. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and commanding. Henry had been in the barn brushing Lucky's coat, the rhythmic strokes soothing both horse and man. When the sound echoed again, louder this time, Henry frowned and stepped outside. At his gate stood two men in uniform, their truck idling in the dirt road. Behind them, leaning against the hood with a cigar in hand, was Earl Thompson. "Mr. Walker," one of the deputies called, unfolding a document. "We've been asked to serve you with a notice. This horse," he gestured toward the barn where Lucky stamped uneasily, "is claimed property of Mr. Thompson here. Until the matter is settled, he's filed with the county to have ownership reviewed." Henry's stomach twisted, anger bubbling hot in his chest. "Claimed property?" he growled. "That horse was abandoned. I found him half dead in the desert. If I hadn't stepped in, there wouldn't be anything left to claim." Earl stepped forward, smoke curling from the corner of his mouth. "Doesn't matter how you spin it, Walker. He's the son of one of my best mares. I've got papers to prove it. That colt's mine." Henry clenched his fists, every instinct screaming to throw the man off his land, but the deputy's presence held him back. He turned instead to Lucky, who had pressed his head against the stall door, eyes wide with unease. "He belongs here," Henry said quietly, though his voice shook with fury. The deputies left the papers and drove off with Earl trailing behind, but the weight of their visit hung heavy over the farm. Mary arrived later that morning to find Henry pacing outside the barn, the notice crumpled in his hand. "They're trying to take him," he said, his voice raw. "Thompson wants the law to do what he couldn't, steal him back." Mary scanned the paper, her brow furrowed. He's got money and connections, Henry. Men like that usually get their way. Henry shook his head fiercely. Not this time. Not with lucky word spread quickly through the small town. Some sympathized with Henry, remembering how he had nursed the foal back from the brink. Others muttered that Earl was within his rights if the horse truly came from his stock. The gossip grew louder when Earl began showing Lucky's supposed lineage papers at the feed store and saloon. Jake heard the talk, too. He sat in the corner of the saloon, his drink untouched, guilt tearing him apart. He knew the truth. Earl had ordered him to abandon the colt, to leave him for dead. And he had obeyed. Now, watching the man claim ownership again, Jake felt his shame harden into something sharper. He couldn't stay silent forever. Back at the farm, Henry doubled his efforts to protect Lucky. He reinforced the barn doors, kept the gates locked, and spent restless nights with a shotgun propped beside the stall. Lucky sensed the tension, his movements jittery, but he grew calmer whenever Henry touched his neck and whispered reassurance. You're mine, boy. They can't take that from us. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Mary found Henry sitting on the porch, the notice lying on the table beside him. You need help, she said simply. Get someone who knows the law. You can't fight this alone. Henry rubbed his temples, weary but resolute. I'll find someone. But even if I stand in front of a judge, all I've got is my word against his papers. Mary's gaze softened. Then maybe it's not just your word you need. At that same hour, Jake paced in his bunkhouse, torment eating at him. He remembered the foal's eyes the day he left him in the desert. He remembered Henry's face at the fair, glowing with pride, and he remembered Earl's cruel laugh when he called the colt worthless. Jake clenched his fists. The truth was a burden only he could lift, and it might be the only chance Henry had. The law had been set in motion, but the heart of the fight was just beginning. For Henry and Lucky, survival was no longer about food or shelter. It was about holding on to the bond they had built in defiance of greed and power. And in the distance, the lines were being drawn, ready for a battle where not even the law could guarantee justice. The courthouse in town smelled of paper, dust, and old wood polished by decades of footsteps. Henry had not set foot inside for years, not since his discharge hearings after the war, and now the weight of it pressed down on him again. He sat at a worn oak table, his weathered hands folded tightly, while across from him Earl Thompson lounged in an expensive suit, his lawyer whispering confidently at his side. Lucky wasn't there. The deputies had agreed the horse could stay on Henry's farm until judgment was passed, but Henry felt his absence keenly, as if part of him had been left behind. The proceedings were brief, too brief for Henry's liking. Earl's lawyer presented papers, breeding records, lineage documents, proof that Lucky had been foaled on Thompson's ranch. The judge, a gray-haired man with a reputation for sticking to the letter of the law, listened with impassive eyes. When Henry's turn came, he rose slowly, his voice rough with emotion as he spoke. That horse was abandoned, Henry said, left to die in the desert. I found him starving, broken, barely breathing. I didn't just feed him. I gave him my strength, my time, my care. Without me, there wouldn't be a horse for you to claim. The courtroom murmured, some nodding in agreement, others frowning. The judge lifted a hand for silence. Do you have evidence of this abandonment, mister? Walker? Witnesses? Henry's throat tightened. He had no papers, no photographs, nothing but his word, and the living proof of Lucky himself. "All I have is the truth," he said, his voice breaking. Earl's lawyer smirked, shuffling his papers. "The truth is in the documents, Your Honor. This horse belongs to Mr. Thompson. That Mr. Walker chose to harbor him changes nothing." The gavel struck once, silencing the room. The judge announced a recess before delivering his decision, but Henry could read the direction of the tide. Without more, the law leaned toward Earl. He walked out into the sunlight, shoulders heavy, the edges of his vision dimmed with despair. Mary caught up to him on the courthouse steps. "You need someone else to stand with you," she said firmly. "Someone who knows what happened that night." Henry shook his head. "There is no one." Thompson made sure of it. But he was wrong. In the shadows of the saloon that same night, Jake sat hunched over a drink, listening to the gossip. The trial had stirred the town, and word was spreading that Earl would likely win. Jake's stomach twisted with guilt. He remembered the day Earl had ordered him to take the foal away, remembered the pleading eyes of the colt as he tossed the rope aside and forced himself to walk away. He could almost feel those eyes burning into him still. His hands trembled as he pressed the glass to his lips. Enough was enough. He couldn't let the man who had called that colt worthless now steal it back after someone else had saved it. Jake rose abruptly, startling the bartender, and left without a word. The next morning, as Henry prepared for another weary day, he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside his porch. He opened the door to find Jake standing there, hat in hand, eyes full of torment. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Jake swallowed hard. "It was me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was the one who left him out there." Thompson ordered it. I obeyed. Henry stared, stunned. Anger flared hot inside him, but it was drowned by the sudden surge of hope. Here, at last, was the witness he needed. "Will you tell that to the judge?" he asked. Jake's eyes burned with shame. "If it means putting things right, yes. I can't carry it any longer." The day of the final hearing came. The courthouse was packed, the townsfolk eager for a spectacle. Earl swaggered in, confident, while Henry sat stiffly, his weathered hands clenched. Then Jake stepped forward, his boots loud against the wooden floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he took the stand. "I worked for Mr. Thompson," Jake began. His voice shook, but he pressed on. "When that foal was born small and weak, he told me to take it out and get rid of it. He called it worthless, a waste of good breeding. I did as he said. I left it in the desert to die. That man abandoned the horse, Your Honor. The only reason it's alive is because Mr. Walker saved it." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the scratching of the judge's pen. Earl's lawyer leapt up, objecting furiously, but the damage had been done. The truth had entered the room, and it clung to the air like smoke. Henry's eyes met Jake's across the room. For the first time in months, he felt the weight lift from his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. The fight for Lucky's soul had begun in the desert, but now it had found its way into the heart of the law. And for the first time, Henry dared to believe they might win. The courthouse was filled to bursting when the final hearing began. Farmers in worn hats, ranch wives with children on their laps, townsfolk hungry for drama, all crowded the benches, their whispers rising and falling like restless waves. Henry sat at his table, shoulders straight despite the weight pressing down on him. Across the room, Earl Thompson leaned back in his chair, smug, his lawyer flipping through papers with an air of confidence. The smell of tobacco and dust mingled in the tense air. The judge entered, his gavel striking once, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "We are here to conclude the matter of ownership of the colt in question," he began. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Earl and Henry in turn. Earl's lawyer rose first, delivering a polished speech. He presented lineage documents again, painted Earl as a respected breeder, and cast Henry as a misguided old man clinging to something that wasn't his. The words rolled smoothly, practiced, designed to impress. When he finished, Earl smirked and tipped his hat to the gallery as if victory were already his. Then came Henry's turn. He stood slowly, every bone aching, but his voice was steady. "This horse was left to die," he said, his words simple, unadorned. "I found him starving and broken. I gave him food, water, and care. He survived because I refused to turn away. If you take him now, you aren't rewarding breeding. You're rewarding cruelty." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some nodded in agreement, others looked doubtful, their eyes sliding toward the judge, who scribbled notes impassively. Henry's heart pounded. He feared his words alone would not be enough. Then Jake stepped forward. The young man looked pale but resolute as he took the stand. His confession spilled into the silence. How Earl had ordered him to abandon the foal, how he had obeyed, how he had lived with the shame ever since. His voice shook, but he didn't falter. "That colt wasn't just neglected," Jake said, his eyes burning. "He was thrown away. If Mr. Walker hadn't found him, he'd be bones in the desert right now." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Mary, seated in the gallery, pressed a hand to her lips. Earl's face darkened with fury, his lawyer scrambling to discredit Jake. "This is nothing but revenge from a disgruntled former employee," he barked. But Jake stood his ground. "I don't want revenge," he said quietly. "I just want the truth known." The judge leaned back, his eyes heavy with thought. The silence stretched unbearably long before he spoke again. "The law is clear on property," he said, his tone grave. "But the law also recognizes intent. To deliberately abandon an animal to die is to forfeit responsibility, if not formally, then in spirit." His gaze shifted to Earl. "You may have bred that colt, Mr. Thompson, but you cast him aside. Mr. Walker saved him. This court cannot in good conscience return him to the man who deemed him worthless." The gavel struck once more. "Ownership is hereby awarded to Mr. Henry Walker." For a moment, the room erupted in sound, cheers, applause, angry shouts. But Henry heard nothing. His knees weakened, relief flooding through him like water after a drought. He sat heavily, his hands trembling. Across the aisle, Earl's face twisted in rage, his cigar snapping between his teeth. Lucky was waiting at the farm when Henry returned, head lifting the moment he heard his footsteps. Henry wrapped his arms around the colt's neck, burying his face in the warm coat. "You're home, boy," he whispered, tears soaking into Lucky's mane. "No one can take you now." But even in the joy of victory, Henry felt the lingering weight of Earl's glare in the courtroom. This wasn't over, not yet. Greed like his didn't vanish with a judge's ruling. Henry knew another reckoning was coming, one that wouldn't be fought with words or papers. Still, as the evening sun stretched long shadows across the barnyard, Henry allowed himself a moment of peace. Lucky pressed his muzzle against his chest, and for the first time in years, Henry believed that justice, real justice, had found him. The weeks after the trial should have been peaceful, but tension lingered like a storm cloud over Henry's farm. Earl Thompson had lost in the courtroom, but he was not the kind of man to accept defeat quietly. Rumors drifted through town. Earl was planning to enter one of his prized stallions into the upcoming state race, determined to prove his superiority. He wanted to show the world that his horses still reigned supreme, while Henry's rescued stray would fade into obscurity. Henry ignored the gossip at first. He focused on his daily rhythm, feeding Lucky, brushing his coat until it gleamed, watching him stretch his legs across the pasture with a speed that made Henry's heart leap. But beneath the pride, a gnawing unease remained. Earl's shadow was never far. One afternoon, Jake arrived at the farm, his hat pulled low. He hadn't been back since the trial, but his voice was steady now, freer somehow. "Earl's set on bringing you down," he warned. "He'll use that race to humiliate you. He's already telling folks your colt won't stand a chance against his bloodlines." Henry leaned on the fence, watching Lucky canter gracefully across the field. "I don't care about races," he said. "I just care about him." Jake shook his head. "It's not about the race, Henry. It's about making a point. If Lucky runs and wins, it'll silence Earl in a way no judge ever could." Mary, who had come by, with fresh bread, overheard the conversation. She crossed her arms and gave Henry a hard look. "He's right. You can't hide out here forever. That colt was born to run. And maybe, just maybe, you were meant to show him the way." Henry bristled at the thought. He was no trainer, no competitor. His war-scarred body ached after even the simplest chores. But when he looked at Lucky, standing tall with the wind in his mane, he saw the truth. The horse wasn't just surviving anymore. He was waiting for a chance to prove himself. The decision weighed on Henry in the nights that followed. He lay awake, listening to the creak of the barn, remembering the first days when Lucky had been nothing but skin and bone. He thought of the fair, the courtroom, the countless moments when the colt had defied every expectation. At dawn, he rose with his answer. Training began quietly, without announcement. Henry marked a track in the pasture with old fence posts and stones. He timed Lucky's runs with his pocket watch, noting the seconds, pushing gently for more each day. Jake helped, bringing what little he knew from his time on Earl's ranch. Mary, too, though she pretended to be uninterested, often stood at the fence line, offering sharp observations. "He favors his left leg," she remarked one morning. "Work it out before the big day, or Earl will use it against you." Lucky responded with a fire Henry hadn't seen before. The colt ran not out of fear or command, but with joy, as though each stride was a declaration. "I am alive, and I will not be broken." His muscles filled out, his coat gleamed, and his eyes shone with confidence. The day of the state race arrived with clear skies and a restless crowd. Trucks and trailers lined the grounds, banners flapping in the breeze. Earl stood near the paddock, his stallion gleaming like polished obsidian, a living monument to wealth and breeding. His smirk widened when he saw Henry leading Lucky through the gate. "So the old fool's really going through with it," Earl sneered. "This will be entertaining." Henry ignored him, focusing on Lucky. The colt trembled, not with fear, but anticipation. Henry leaned close, whispering into his ear. You don't have to win, boy. You just have to run your heart out. That'll be enough." The crowd hushed as the announcer called the riders to the line. 6 horses pawed the ground, muscles coiled like springs. Lucky stood among them, smaller, leaner, the outsider. The pistol fired, and they surged forward. For the first stretch, Lucky held back, his stride steady but unhurried. Earl's stallion leapt to the front, the crowd roaring. Henry's chest tightened, but he didn't shout. He trusted. He waited. Then, as they rounded the final bend, Lucky found another gear. His body stretched, his stride lengthened, and suddenly he was flying. The crowd gasped as he devoured the ground, pulling even, then ahead. The white star on his forehead blazed under the sun as, though guiding him forward, he crossed the finish line a length ahead, his chest heaving, ears pricked. Silence held for a heartbeat before the stands erupted in thunderous applause. Henry stumbled forward, tears streaming freely. Lucky pressed his muzzle into his chest, and the old man laughed through his sobs. Earl stood frozen, his face twisted with disbelief and rage. The race hadn't just been about speed, it had been about heart. And Lucky's heart had carried the day. Henry stroked the colt's mane, whispering, "You chose your path, boy. And I chose mine. Together, we proved them wrong." It wasn't the victory itself that mattered. It was the choice to stand, to run, to fight not with law or money, but with heart. And in that choice, Henry and Lucky had found freedom. The days after the race felt like a dream Henry never wanted to wake from. Everywhere he went, people spoke of the chestnut colt with the white star who had outrun Earl Thompson's prized stallion. At the feed store, men slapped Henry on the back, offering congratulations. In town, children pointed and whispered, "That's Lucky's man." For the first time in decades, Henry was no longer just the old soldier who lived on the edge of the desert. He was the man who had saved a horse no one believed in, and together, they had made history. But back at the farm, the noise of the world faded. Henry sat on the porch in the cool evening, watching Lucky graze in the pasture. The colt's coat gleamed like polished copper under the setting sun, muscles rippling with strength that seemed impossible compared to the frail creature he had once carried home on his mule. Each stride Lucky took across the field was a reminder of what they had endured together. Mary joined him often now, bringing pies or jars of preserves, though she pretended it was only to check on the horse. She would sit beside Henry, her sharp tongue softened by the sight of Lucky tossing his mane, running for the sheer joy of it. "You know," she said one night, "he's changed you as much as you've changed him." Henry smiled, his eyes never leaving the colt. "Maybe he gave me back what I thought I'd lost." Jake visited too, quieter than Mary, but no less loyal. The guilt that had once weighed him down seemed lighter now. He spent hours helping mend fences, cleaning the barn, and sometimes just standing near Lucky, who had forgiven him in ways no words could express. The horse would press his muzzle gently against Jake's shoulder, as if to say the past no longer mattered. But not all shadows had vanished. Earl Thompson remained bitter, his pride shattered by the trial and the race. He no longer spoke openly in town, but Henry knew men like him did not let go easily. One afternoon, Mary voiced what they all felt. "He'll try again, Henry." Maybe not in the courts or on the track, but men like Earl, they find other ways. Henry nodded slowly. I know. But Lucky isn't his to break anymore. He made his choice. It was true. For all the races and trials, the most powerful moment had not been crossing a finish line. It had been the countless times Lucky had pressed his head against Henry's chest, choosing him, again and again. One evening, as the desert wind carried the scent of rain, Henry opened the pasture gate and let Lucky run. The colt thundered across the open land, faster than ever, mane streaming behind him like a banner of fire. Henry watched, his heart swelling until it hurt, and Mary whispered, almost to herself, "It's like watching a miracle." And perhaps it was. Not just the miracle of a half-dead foal growing into a champion, but of a broken man finding purpose again. Together, they had stitched 2 lives back into wholeness, man and horse, each saving the other. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Henry leaned against the fence, tears slipping down his weathered cheeks. Lucky slowed, circling back, and trotted to him, pressing his forehead gently against Henry's chest. "You're my miracle," Henry whispered, voice trembling. "Not because you run fast, not because you beat him, but because you gave me back my heart." The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh and unforgiving. Yet within that vastness stood 2 souls who had defied it. The old soldier and the abandoned foal, bound by a choice that had rewritten both their destinies. And in the quiet of that evening, as the wind settled and the stars began to rise, it was clear. Miracles don't always come in the way you expect. Sometimes they arrive on trembling legs with a fragile heart that refuses to stop beating. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a horse called Lucky. And that was the miracle of Lucky, the foal who was left to die, but chose love over everything else. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple one in the comments to let me know you're here. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next emotional story of hope, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. The next tale might move you even more.